Next up, Chapter 16, having to do with economic growth and lots of industries, primarily agriculture in the 1870s and 1880s. And we'll talk about the growing of wheat in the Central Valley first. During the dry years that they experienced in early California in the early 1860s, that pretty much ruined the cattle industry. That did, however, give way to wetter years in the late 1860s and early 1870s, which led farmers to grow wheat without irrigating it, which was really quite something. Remember that the Great Central Valley, before it started to become developed into organized farming, was a great inland marsh because all of the runoff from Sierra snowmelt was unencumbered by dams and reservoirs. For nearly 30 years after that, from the early 1870s on, it was the most profitable crop in California, especially in the flatlands of the Central Valley. One particular wheat grower is noteworthy. His name was Dr. Hugh Glenn, who owned a 55,000-acre wheat empire in the Sacramento Valley along the western side of the Sacramento River. He died in 1891, and a county was named after him. You, I believe, named Glenn County in map quiz number 2, if I'm not mistaken. The need for mechanical power to quickly and efficiently harvest the wheat led to the invention of the tractor, first using steam power in 1886, and then later Benjamin Holt of Stockton, California. He was originally from back east, but he moved with his dad to Stockton, adapted the tractor to the internal combustion engine and invented the Caterpillar track wheel system that we're all so familiar with today. If you have the time, please cut and paste that web address, that YouTube web address, into another browser and watch this interesting video that I found about Benjamin Holt of Stockton, California. The labor on the wheat ranches was performed by migrant workers known as bindlemen. Even though they had these mechanical harvesters, these combined mechanical harvesters, which they eventually called combines, they still needed several dozen people to work these machines and work in the fields. So the first migrant workers in the wheat fields were called bindlemen because of the little backpacks that they carried as they went from one job to another. Let's talk about early California's wine industry. Of course, the Mission Padres made wine, but it was for sacramental purposes or for their own consumption. French vintner Jean-Louis Vignes brought cuttings from France back to a vineyard that he started in Los Angeles in the 1830s. A guy by the name of William Wolfskill also established a vineyard in the LA area at that time. Later on, the center of grape and wine production, that's wine, not wind. Well, they have wind production there too. Wine production shifted up to the Bay Area. There was a Hungarian by the name of Augustin Haraszthy. He was making wine in California in a small way. He was actually appointed wine commissioner in 1861, went back to Europe, and came back with 200,000 cuttings representing 1,400 varietals. There was also a small wine cooperative that started in Anaheim in the late 1850s, which was actually a German farming colony, if you were wondering about that place with a German name in the middle of Southern California with all those Spanish place names. Phylloxera was a disease that wiped out the wine industry in the 1870s and 1880s. They replanted the vines with hardier stalks that could resist this disease. Obviously, the industry has recovered, and as you well know, Fresno State is one of the premier schools for viticulture and enology anywhere in the world, with the only university that has a licensed bonded winery, and of course with the fame of the movie Bottle Shock, which no doubt you've heard about. Let's talk about the citrus industry now. The significant beginnings of citrus growing in California came with 3 new developments in the 1870s. First of all, the discovery that oranges grew a whole lot better when they're grown away from the coastal fog belt. Second of all, the introduction of the navel orange from Brazil, if you're wondering where that came from. And third of all, the expansion of the railroads. Navel oranges were first successfully grown in California in the area what is now western Riverside County by J.W. North. Of course, this was on the bank of the Santa Ana River, and that eventually became known as the city of Riverside, which is, of course, quite famous for orange growing. The expansion of orange farming and the development of refrigerated cars, rail cars, facilitated the explosive growth in the citrus industry in the late 1870s and 1880s as all that fruit was shipped back to Midwestern and Eastern markets where people craved it. Now, since the markets for California citrus were 2,000 to 3,000 miles away, farmers had little or no information regarding market trends or prices. Sometimes they'd ship in these refrigerated rail cars oranges all the way to the East Coast, only to find that prices were so depressed they couldn't even recover the cost of shipping. So that led to the development of cooperative marketing organizations. Most important of those early marketing organizations in the early 20th century was a group called the California Fruit Growers Exchange, which started in 1905, which had the name brand for their oranges as Sunkist, and eventually the name of the cooperative was changed to Sunkist Growers in 1952. And of course, they were known for these very colorful fruit labels on the fruit boxes. Citrus farmers and orchard owners started calling themselves growers because they felt the term grower was a notch above simple farmers. Such grower co-ops and marketing organizations took root in other crops: raisins, walnuts, dairy, poultry, etc. Private wholesalers and independent farmers and growers denounced such co-ops as communism, wouldn't you know. The benefits of the citrus cooperatives, however, went to the growers and not the unorganized and disenfranchised people who did the physical work, the hard grunt work of picking, processing, and packing those oranges. The citrus industry was built on cheap alien labor. This is still an issue today throughout agribusiness in California, as you well know, with all this hubbub right now about immigration reform. Agriculture then in the late 1800s in California became known as agribusiness, not just agriculture. Part of the reason why Southern California eventually became so populated was because the railroads did a lot of marketing to people in the Midwest and back east to come to Southern California to buy cheap property. The railroads had a lot of property to sell. And there was a lot of marketing going on. There was a shift then in population growth in California from the north to the south in the 1880s. There were a number of false medical theories regarding how Southern California's climate would cure tuberculosis and that children would grow stronger and bigger and so on and so forth. Southern Pacific specifically had a lot of land to sell, and it took a leading part in the campaign to market Southern California land for sale, and they were the ones that actually launched the publication of Sunset Magazine in 1898. Here is an early cover of Sunset Magazine from February 1903. When the Santa Fe Railroad reached L.A., Southern Pacific was no longer the only game in town, and it began a rate war with Southern Pacific, and for a brief time you could actually buy a ticket on the Santa Fe Railroad from Kansas City to L.A. as a passenger for $1. So the race was on. Low fares, advertising, all this led to a real estate boom in Los Angeles. In 1887 alone, real estate sales in Los Angeles County exceeded $200 million. By 1920, the Bay Area and Los Angeles had roughly equal populations, about 1 million each, but after that time, the demographics certainly did shift, and that's why Southern California ultimately became much more populated than the Bay Area. Water and land are two big things that are still issues in California today. So let's talk about the early water battles. One of them had to do with the battle against Sacramento Valley farming interests and hydraulic miners. Remember, they used to wash entire hillsides away. This method called hydraulic mining to do gold mining, and that dumped a lot of mud and sand and gravel into the Sierra rivers that eventually drained into the Sacramento River. The Yuba River, the Bear, the Feather, the American. And this made the rivers more shallow, made the rivers no longer navigable by boats and barges, and caused a lot of winter and spring floods because the river beds were more shallow with all that silt on the bottom. In 1884, a U.S. Circuit Court actually made a ruling outlawing the dumping of hydraulic mining debris into the rivers. The mining interests were a little ticked off at that, and they continued in a rather clandestine fashion. But a federal California Debris Commission was actually established in 1893 to control this environmental degradation. Then there was the other issue, the second major battle, farmers versus the water monopolies dealing with irrigation water. So here's the deal. We have to get into some legalese here. In early California, the water policy encouraged water monopolies, people who controlled water so they could sell it for irrigation purposes. It was based on the common law of England, which included a concept called riparian rights. California adopted this in 1850 when it first became a state. This meant that the owner of land adjacent to a stream or a river had full rights to a reasonable use of that water. The owners of the land who were not contiguous to that stream had absolutely no rights to use that water. Now, this is in spite of the fact that the mining camps at the time were adopting an opposing system, which was used in other parts of Europe that were drier than England, Spain, France, and Italy. This concept was known as prior appropriation. This meant that the first user of a stream had unrestrained right to divert it from the stream, the water from the stream, and sell that right to others. So it's a different concept entirely. This brings us to the case of Lux versus Hagen. Now, you remember Charles Lux. He was a partner with Henry Miller, and they owned a lot of cattle ranches in the San Joaquin Valley. They owned a 50-mile stretch of the Kern River near Bakersfield. They had operations that far south. They had a cattle ranch there. Then there was a guy named James B. Hagen and his partner Lloyd Tevis. They acquired rights of appropriation further upstream on the Kern River with the intent of diverting water through irrigation canals to sell that water to lands at some distance from the river. Well, in 1886, the state Supreme Court ruled that the riparian rights of Lux and Miller had priority over Hagen's and Tevis's right of appropriation upstream on the Kern River, making Hagen and Tevis's appropriation illegal. This is still considered to be one of the most important water rights cases in California history, and there's a link if you care to read more about it. It's really quite interesting. This Lux versus Hagen decision resulted in a stormy legislative session in the summer of 1886, leading to the passage of what was called the Right Irrigation Act of 1887. It called for the establishment of irrigation districts. These are special units of local government that could be formed by 50 or more landowners or by a majority of landowners in an area. These irrigation districts then had the power of eminent domain. They had the power to overcome riparian rights by condemnation suits, and they had the right to sell bonds to finance the purchase of water rights and also to construct dams, canals, and other irrigation works. In the first year of the Right Irrigation Act of 1887, 10 districts were established covering 1 million acres of California land, irrigation districts. Here's one particular interesting irrigation district that was started by George Chaffee, down in what used to be called the Colorado Valley, east of San Diego, which then became the Imperial Valley. Chaffee secured the services of the California Development Company in 1900. He built a 70-mile irrigation canal across the Mexican border at the towns that are known now as Mexicali and Calexico. He renamed the Colorado Desert the Imperial Valley and started a big influx of people there who wanted to farm because there was irrigation water. Chaffee left the company in 1905. His successors built a risky bypass canal that broke during torrential rains in 1905, which then filled an area called the Salton Sink, which became what is today known as the Salton Sea. And here is a photograph from NASA showing the Salton Sea and the irrigation to the south and north of it today in the Imperial Valley and to the north in the Coachella Valley. Now let's talk about electric railways and how people live farther away from the city center because of electrified transportation. Electric trolley cars made it possible for people to live farther away from the city center. Maybe cities then could expand to as much as 80 square miles as opposed to the 12 square miles before this innovation of electric rail cars. This was quite important from the 1890s until the beginning of the automobile dominance in 1919. There was a guy named Francis Smith who expanded urban railways in the San Francisco Bay's eastern cities with connecting ferry service. And then there was Henry Huntington, nephew of Collis Huntington, who invested in a consolidation expansion of the street and interurban railways of the Los Angeles region called the PE, the Pacific Electric Railway. This fellow, Henry Huntington, who was just mentioned, he needed electricity to run those LA streetcars, and so he built a hydroelectric plant at Big Creek in eastern Fresno County in 1913 to produce the electricity that he needed for those electric rail cars in LA. Then there was a 248-mile-long, 150,000-volt transmission line that delivered the needed electricity to L.A. all the way from eastern Fresno County to Huntington's streetcars. Hence, the lake called Huntington Lake in eastern Fresno County and the street in downtown Fresno and east central Fresno or southeast Fresno that bears the name of Henry Huntington in Fresno County. And that ends Chapter 16.